So back in the winter of 2022, I embarked on a brand new project, which was to teach myself Dorico 4 and move over from using Finale, which I've been on Finale since 2005, and I was currently using Finale 27. So moving over to Dorico 4 was a huge change, and this is something I've been wanting to talk about because I know a lot of people who are using Finale or Sibelius, and I just want to give you a fair perspective from my point of view after switching from Finale to Dorico. So let's get into it. So if you're not familiar with any of those software that I just mentioned, Finale, Sibelius, and Dorico are kind of the industry standards for making sheet music. Stuff like this, you know, big, crazy sheet music. And the thing about a lot of these different softwares is that they're pretty tough to work with, and they are a ton of work to learn. I started with Finale 2005, and before that I had been using some free program I got from a library that was even worse than Finale. One of the main reasons I found Finale is so easy to work with compared to Sibelius was I did a lot of work with percussion, and it had a nice way of organizing percussion sections. The MIDI wasn't too bad in 2005. I mean, compared to now, it's not even close. But for $500, $600, whatever it was back then, it was quite an investment, and I used it all the time, almost every day, for everything from strings, percussion, brass, you name it. I've done it in Finale. Even doing some more weird works, aleatoric works. I've done film scores in Finale as well. Finale and I have a love-hate relationship now because of all the things that it kind of isn't good at. I'll say that my favorite iteration of Finale was Finale 2014, which I feel like had the least number of glitches for me. I'm on a PC, and it's a pretty strong PC as well, but it really blows my mind when I run into some of the glitches on Finale. Right, so I've been using Finale for a very long time, so I'm very quick with the shortcuts. I get hired by different arts organizations, performers, and arrangers to do arrangements, as well as engraving, and so I work pretty well with Finale. And there are a lot of things about Finale that are amazing. But at the same time, there's a lot of ways that they have fallen behind in the industry. One of the worst things is the inability or the lack of ability to really use MIDI messages with Finale. Now, of course, you're going to say, hey, wait, I can definitely set up my keyboard and play into Finale. That's great. Yes, you can do that. But I'm talking about messages beyond that, like setting your articulations or doing things with, you know, my favorite, TouchOSC. Now this is my TouchOSC template for Finale. It's actually got a bunch of different pages because this is like my basic composing template. So anything I'm working on from Reaper to Dorico to Finale, it's already set up in this across different pages. And all of these buttons are controlled by macros. So that's like Control plus Shift plus 5. Or with Finale, you can get really weird with Control, Alt, Shift, F7, things like that with their macro system. And I know this is something we've talked about before, right? So go into Plugins and then TG Tools, and then you can set your menu shortcuts. Now these are helpful. There's a lot of different things in here. You can set different macros to open different tools, like on the toolbar here. And a lot of the time, they're great. But multiple times, I've had those macros change on their own. Because Finale has this strange knack for doing things on its own and changing things. I've had buttons that I've set up on here work one day, the next day I go in and let's say using the plugin for cross staves no longer works. Or running a Finale script to move everything from voice 1 or layer 1 to layer 2 no longer works. I go into that plugin menu and I look at it, and basically it just deactivated the macro. Hugely annoying, especially when I'm in a time crunch, but Finale has a lot of these types of glitches. I've run into instances where when I'm printing to PDF, because I couldn't do the export feature which I think came around maybe like 2015, but for the longest time, nothing ever worked. It always spit out things in the wrong size, and I know you can do postscript sizing for pages. A lot of the time the Finale fonts wouldn't work, like the Percussion fonts, so I was always printing to PDF because I do have the Adobe suite, and that would work really well with doing the print work for PDF. But I've had articulations move off of notes and be on the side of the page. I've had lines that should be going to the end of a system go all the way over a system, or they'll disappear entirely from the page. This happens often when you use Control-E on a PC and go back and forth between what Dorico calls the gallery view or the page view. And then there's all sorts of issues with global objects. Let's say you want to put in a ritardando, and you do that with a line, right? So right over here with the flute one, I'm just gonna drop that line in. Now this is great. It's on my full score here, and I would expect this along with, let's just put in a retard R, hold that down. You'd expect this to show in the parts. And note that this should be right here on measure 11. Going all the way down, measure 11. It's probably locked up in there, so it's not showing it. Or we go down to alto sax. We have the rit, but we don't have the line. So not having global objects is a huge problem, and a lot of the time when I'm working on a score and I need to have these lines, I have to do it individually for each staff, and then I have to hide it in the full score. Just like doing that with text. And the last straw for working with Finale for me was lyrics. You're all probably familiar with the lyric system in Finale, and it is insane. It's so complex, and it's also so easy at the same time. Getting a simple song and putting it in, that's no problem at all. But if you're doing a full orchestra, let's say an opera with chorus and individual parts, it gets really complicated having each part and then having to edit that later on. So for example, I did an arrangement for a publication, and this was small orchestra plus chorus plus soloists. In this first draft, we had everything laid out, and then some of the text changed. So I had to go back in and change all of the text. And of course that means that with a piece like this, which had something like 12 movements, a lot of the text would get shifted around when I would make these changes, which is infuriating and confusing. Additionally, with 12 movements and let's say 2 soloists per movement, plus 4 parts for the chorus, that made an insane number of parts that each had its own text set, or paragraphs, right, in Finale. Additionally, I had to make separate files because the orchestra score and the chorus book and then the piano reduction all had to be different sizes, and they all had to have different layouts for all of the different parts. Finale makes it way too confusing, and so it ended up being a time saver to just set up 3 separate documents, which meant that when we had changes to the text by the artist, we had to change it in all 3 parts, as opposed to just changing it in one and having it change across the board. Movements in Finale, just like lyrics, really just don't work well. I've done multi-movement works with Finale, and every time I do that, I tend to just do it in a separate file, a separate document, because it's just easier for me to make sure I'm keeping track of all of the changes. But again, I've been using this since 2005, so I feel like I've used a lot of the parts of it. I just need something to work. So fast forward to 2022, and in the summer, a big sale happened for Musician's Friend, and Dorico was on sale, so I decided to just go ahead and buy it. And of course, Dorico isn't perfect. There's plenty of things I'd love for them to fix, but let's take a look at some of the things that I find incredibly helpful, things that I think are going to be great and a big game changer for engraving or doing your own composing. All right, first things first, and this is just a quality of life situation, holding control and being able to use my scroll wheel. Oh, that's just amazing. All right, check this out. So these are aleatoric scenes in my piece, Moonshot. Let's take a look at just this number 4, this aleatoric scene here. And if I was to go into engrave mode, and let's say I needed to move this over in, let's say it's the flute 1 part. So it's a little too close, I need to move it over. All right, that's done. Now if we look at the full score, nothing's happened to my number 4, and that's because there are global and local properties. So when it's set to local, it's only changing it on the part that you're working on, which is selected up here. If you're in setup, let's talk about percussion instruments. This piece was commissioned by a high school that had 7 percussionists, and I also have a version for 5 percussionists. But each percussionist is playing quite a few different instruments. And similarly to Finale, you can have different percussion setups. But one of the things that I like so much about this is that it will automatically put in what instrument the percussion's supposed to go to. So right here, you see that percussion 2 is going to triangle and then going to tam-tam. I didn't put these in. That just put them in themselves. And I love that about Dorico, some of the just like really smart things it does on its own that I don't have to worry about. And then of course, having additional instruments for different players is super easy. For instance, if I wanted Flute 1 to also be a piccolo player, I can easily add an instrument, and then what it does is it doesn't show it in the page unless it's being used, and then it'll move it over. So if we look down here with the percussion section, you can see there's multiple percussion too. And that's because this player has a lot of different instruments to cover. But in the page, it's only going to show what's active or what has notes in it. And then you'd have to see the others, the kind of not being used staves. Those are available to be viewed in gallery view until they're used. Dorico has something that I'm sure you've heard of called flows, and that's basically what a movement is. So you can have separate flows for each movement, and that all lives within one document. And you can change the instruments per flow. So I'm engraving a opera for a company, and there is an on-stage scene where there's a completely different set of instruments that are being played by some of the musicians and the singers on stage. So instead of having to create a separate document, that's just another flow, and everything exists within that. I can have the page numbering and the measure numbering continue through that so it relates, because when I put my score together for the conductor, I don't want to have multiple documents, multiple PDFs that I then have to merge in Adobe. So this way it all will exist within the same file, the same Dorico file, and it'll be editable from one file, and it'll also be printed as one file. And then more of those quality of life things that I love, TouchOSC. So working with a new engraving software after many years with Finale, there was definitely a learning curve. So the way I approached this was I decided that I was going to write an entire piece in Dorico, and I was just going to force my way through it. So I pretty much had the shortcuts menu up on my side screen here the whole time. I also had the forums up. People were super helpful there. And I kind of just worked my way through and learning it. There's a lot of great things like being able to use, I have a nice mouse here, a Logitech mouse, and it's got a side scroll button and it has the top scroll. And both of these work within Dorico. It's just a little bit more of a modern system that can accept a lot of different input. Like I said, Control plus mouse wheel can do the zooming, which we expect across basically all software at this point. And then in using TouchOSC, what you can do in Dorico is set MIDI messaging. So here in Dorico, if we go to Edit and then Preferences, you can go to Key Commands, and let's see, one that I have set up here is, let's see, Voices, right? I want to show voice color. And what that means is showing layers, right? When we would call that layers in Finale. So see this voice colors, MIDI 26. And in my TouchOSC template, I have a specific program channel already synced up. So here in Dorico, if I was to change to voice colors, showing the voice colors, you can see that it's now showing some green here, which are cues for the oboe section, for the altos. We have a first clarinet solo going on here. One thing you have to watch out for in showing voice colors, while it's really helpful to work with, if you print, it will print the colors. So you do want to turn that off, which I could do with the click of a button. And sure, people say, hey man, just use the keybinds that are already set up in Dorico. They had a plan. The developers had a plan. Well, I don't really have the time for that. In fact, one thing that I really loved about Finale, or maybe it's just what I got used to, was the numbering system for notes. So if I say 5, what note value is that? Quarter note, you're right. If I say 3, what's that? Yes, it's a 16th note. But Dorico does it differently, and the way they set it up included 64th notes. I don't ever need a 64th note, or if I do, I'm gonna select it because it's so not normal for me to have to put in 64th notes. The way I did this was in working on Moonshot in Dorico. I basically forced myself to use everything with the settings as is, and then as I was working on it, if something bugged me enough, I would either create a new button in my TouchOSC template, or I would just change the actual keybinds. Other things I use TouchOSC for are like changing the grid system for note input in Finale, which is super useful because I can swap easily between quarter note, 8th note, 16th note, whatever, the grid tick system. So if I was inputting a note here at 77, it's showing quarter notes, but with a push of a button, I get 8th notes or 16th notes or 32nd notes. I can also just push a button to go up one, and that just saves me a little bit of time, which I need. Another keybind or shortcut that I used in Finale that I still use in Dorico is beaming separately or together. So if I have 3 notes, 3 8th notes, and I want one to be separate, I can do beam together, or I could select and do beam separately. This is really useful when you're writing vocal music. I do a lot of arrangements for vocal artists, and those 8th notes are not beamed together unless, of course, they are over the same syllable. Now, of course, no software is perfect. There's plenty of things that I would love to see Dorico fix. The thing that I really don't like about Dorico has to do with engraving text objects. So if we move out here and go to the early parts of this document here, so this is what the cover page and the inside program notes look like. Something like this, I would love to be able to click this and drag and move it easier. Additionally, these objects aren't really in the center. If I was to select these boxes here, you have to set the frame distance to make it center. There's no move to center button like there is in Adobe, and that would be super useful. And then my last qualm, if you want to say it's a qualm with Dorico, is that there's just way too many different menus. There's the engraving options, there's notation options, and there's layout options. And oftentimes something that I think is a notation issue is an engraving issue, or an engraving issue is actually a layout issue. So things like that, they haven't worked that out yet, but I'm giving them time because there's so much about Dorico that I think has really improved how I'm writing music, or at least saving me time. Because a lot of things like inputting crescendos or hairpins, they move perfectly on their own, and you don't have to do any adjustments in the parts unless you have like a really specific instance, like I did with some of the aleatoric sections. So yeah, Dorico is pretty cool. I'm impressed with what it is. I'm excited to see where they're going with it. I've gotten a recent update this past month, which is great, within 4.2, and I'm excited to see where they're going to go with it because they do really seem to be listening to folks on the forums. Finale has some work to do. I still use it because a lot of different companies are hiring me out for projects, and they start with a Finale file or they end with a Finale file. So I'll maintain using Finale, but if you're watching Finale, get your shit together and start fixing some of these things that we've been asking for forever, specifically fixing the lyrics system. Now here's the real kicker about all this stuff. MuseScore. I know a lot of people that are using it and love it. If you're using it, let me know what you think. I've talked to a couple students, and they're really cracking out some nice orchestral works with that. So if you're finding that to work for you, and you're also able to use MIDI input with things like TouchOSC, let me know, because I think it could be worth doing a video about. So thanks for watching and tuning into the channel. Hopefully you learned some things about Dorico and how you can actually use TouchOSC with Dorico. And, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Yeah, more stuff to talk about. I'll see you next time.